possible. Okay? So I'll just talk a little bit about what this means, and I don't want to talk too long because I know we have other commitments here. What we have to realize is that what we're talking about is the supreme law in Canada. Okay? Your agreement is part of supreme law. And that's really, really, really important. It's the highest law in this country. And it's supported by international law. So it can't be refuted. Your agreements are entrenched. Your people did your homework. Your negotiators did their work. Your chiefs did your work. You now are recognized by everybody as governments. That's really, really important. You can't do anything more. You've accomplished what Elijah Smith and the elders here, the elders on our side, on the other side of the mountains, we're working together on this. Remember when we formed one organization, because at one time they had non-status and they had status. Remember that discussion? You brought one organization together. We tried to do the same, but it was more difficult for us. Okay, so we have a history together. Supreme law. Okay, so these court cases I talked about happened before the Canadian Constitution happened in 1982. So 9 years before we established the Bill of Rights. We're in negotiations. By 1982, the Canadian Constitution gets decreed. So the rights that we had are recognizing them more. It's the easiest way to say it. There's no question that you have the rights. And in international law, nobody can take those rights away from you. You have those rights. And so your exercise was then to how to make them work. So you have a legal reality, specific constitutional rights, and you waited for many, many years because the elders always argued that you had them. This finally supports the elders, and it becomes really clear that nobody can argue with you. It's self-evident that you have these rights. Okay? Now, the question then is, what's the problem? Because what this means is that you have a degree of sovereignty. You have a degree of sovereignty because of a whole number of things, but clearly it's because you were here first. The Collette case and Calder decisions made it clear that in order to be recognized as nations, you have to have a land base, you have to be distinct, you have to be organized, you have to be in societies, and you have to be from the original people that come from here. And you proved that. So did we. So did the Nisga'a. So did the Inuit. So you are sovereign peoples, and you have a degree of sovereignty. The problem is that the federal government does not want to recognize it. And the territorial government does not want to recognize it, and others don't. But we know that the public is on your side. The Canadian public, if you did a survey today, you have more than the majority of the people in the country supporting you. They just don't know how to get from here to the point where their governments actually function. Okay? So that's what we need to talk about. Somebody mentioned Delgamuukw this morning. Kind of jumping in time here. Again, from the Constitution to more legal cases. We keep on winning in the courts. By the time we get to Delgamuukw, which is the Wet'suwet'en in British Columbia, are people, they're Dene, they're people that don't have treaties. The Supreme Court is very clear that they have title, that they have rights, that they have a degree of sovereignty, and that there is a moral and a legal obligation to put it into effect. Okay? So the question then is, how do you enact? Okay? People use the word implement. You might be better to use the legal word enact. How do you enact your agreement? How do we enact our treaties? You can actually look at it later, the better terminology. But the Royal Commission also said the same thing, and it was just before Delaware. My understanding, and you can ask your legal people, I'm not trained in law so much, although I did study law. I studied, I'm a political scientist, and my graduate work is in anthropology, and my anthropology was done with our people to study our own laws. I didn't study British common law because I can go to university anytime to do that. But what I did was I talked to our people while they were still alive. So I understand our law better than British common law. But my understanding of British common law is what this country follows, is that if the court says you have a legal duty, that means you have to enact. You have to. And that's 17 years ago. So what's the problem? Who can force the federal government to act? If the people can't, because this Prime Minister is not listening to the people, then you've got to go to the courts. Because our courts are separate. The way the system works is that there's three parts to the parliamentary democracy. There's the parliament, where the MPs are, and I understand the MP was here yesterday. There's the parliament, they make the laws. The ones that are supposed to enact these laws are the executive, which is the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office. Okay, so that's how it works. But then there's the judicial arm, which is not part of this. It's separate. The courts are separate. So the courts step back and they look at this and they say, what's the problem? Why is the country in disarray? And they give the answer. 17 years ago, he said you have a moral and a legal obligation. What I'm thinking is that this shouldn't cost us money, because we ought to be able to go, and this is where our legal people have to help us, we ought to be able to go to the Supreme Court, if not in a public way, in a private way, whatever makes it work. But we should be able to go to the Supreme Justice Beverly McLaughlin and say, Beverly McLaughlin, you're the head of this country in terms of the laws. We need your help. Can you please give the signal to this Prime Minister to enact these agreements? And that might be, we might do that either by sitting down with her, or we send her a letter that we then make public to everybody in the country, or we strategically think about that. Now, how do you do that? But the courts have to. The courts have the ability to force the government. So how do you do that? That's one strategic thing that you got to think about. The other one then is, if that doesn't work, where I'm beginning to think is that you've got to get together with other people in the country. And you all got to say, let's take this question forward as a reference. So you pose a question before the Supreme Court. And you say, tell us, or instruct this government to do its duty, because they have the power to instruct this government. So you all get together across the country, if it's 630 First Nations or whatever it is, if you get together, you pool your money, you pool your resources, and you go to the Supreme Court Justice and you say, we want an answer, because we're tired of this. 40 years ago, the court said we had the rights. Okay? 9, 10 years later, the Constitution says, yes, you have the rights. It's constitutionally entrenched. It's internationally supported. Later, you make an agreement. The courts are even stronger after that.